Good morning, everybody. I have come in from a rainy and cold Manchester, so it's very nice to be here. First of all, hands up if you're a teacher. Great. Hands up if you're a teacher leader. Great. Well, first of all, congratulations for all of you for getting off school today. Well done. I managed to get off school too, and I'm here in Hong Kong, which is great. So I've got a lot of material to cover. I'm going to go quite quickly, but it's the morning session, so I know you can all keep up with me. Today, unapologetically, I'm going to start off by confronting the situation we have all got ourselves into in 2019, which is we are in crisis. Unfortunately, when I was a little boy in London in 1979, and I looked out into the world with a slightly startled expression on my face, probably because of flash photography, which I wasn't used to. It was 1979 after all. My world didn't look quite like a young person's world looks now. If we think now about a young person's world, we have to think about the challenges that face us. But in thinking, I would like us to start off by thinking about thinking itself. No, this will not be a TOK session or anything about epistemology. I'm going to refer to the German philosopher Habermas, Jürgen Habermas of the Frankfurt School. Habermas has spent most of his life thinking about communicative action and how thinking occurs, and he has defined thinking into three particular thinking domains. The first one is the technical thinking domain. The technical thinking domain is what you use when you're thinking about science, mathematics, when you're doing your accounts, when you're doing your tax returns. This is a place where you put your head in order to be in the technical thinking domain space, in order to do technical things, pragmatic day-to-day things as well. The second thinking domain is the interpersonal domain. This is the domain that we use when we talk to each other, when we interact with each other, when we communicate and we talk about relationships. And the third thinking domain is the emancipatory domain. This is the domain we use when we think about being better, about improving, about growing, about education. And this is the thinking domain wherein we find education couched. So we are in crisis. Looking back at that picture of me in 1979, we can see now that the challenges facing young people are significantly different from what they were 40 years ago. I do not envy any young person in this day. And what we're also facing is a crisis of leadership, that Greta Thunberg has to go to the United Nations and, as a 16-year-old girl, tell the world that we are in global crisis means that we are indeed in a place of crisis in so many ways. My question is, what does educational leadership do amongst this crisis? What is its role in educating the citizens that will go out and change the world at the ballot box? Are we failing in what we're doing, in providing solutions to this kind of crisis? The migration crisis, which is happening as we speak, as we sit and stand here comfortably, there are hundreds of thousands of people around the world in turmoil. These are things that are happening amidst the inequality emergency, where we can see that 1.8% of the world own 86% of the global wealth. I've heard it said that this is the most inequitable time in the history of mankind, which I find very hard to believe, because I'm thinking pharaohs, I'm thinking Egypt, I'm thinking dynasties 4,000 years ago. It surely cannot be more inequitable now than it was then. But supposedly it is. If we look at inequality and how it's grown over the last 20 or 30 years, we see a soaring amount of global inequality. And yet we are quite comfortable, because we are couched, sometimes precariously, but generally quite comfortably, in a nice sort of space. What we've also seen is a decline of public thinking, and this is behind much of the inequality and much of the injustice that happens around the world. If you think about it, when I was, in 1979, a little boy, it was quite unusual to think that you might use any other words to describe children other than potentially in schools, other than potentially talking about nurturing and caring and educating and talking to and looking after. Now we use the words of the technical domain, of the business domain, to define children. How many times do you hear people saying, investing in children? We mean it well, but we do not realize how our semantics have changed fundamentally over the last 40 years. What underlies all of these things is the concept of scarcity. If you introduce scarcity into a human system, you introduce competition and antagonism. Public education systems, especially in the United Kingdom, but also the USA and Europe, have seen this kind of scarcity introduced systematically over the last 40 years, which means that we're always thinking about economies of scale, we're thinking about efficiency, we're thinking about downsizing, we're thinking about making departments smaller, about getting more out of less. This is the context that many of our teachers in international schools come from. They bring this concept of scarcity with them, not as what they learnt in their training and their education, but as what they experienced in schools. And this is a reductive kind of thinking, one that also pushes our thinking away from the emancipatory domain into the technical domain, which for education can only be wrong, because education happens in the emancipatory domain. You may have heard of something called the global education reform movement. For all of those big changes I'm talking about, this is the educational version. We've all experienced this before. This is being developed by Pasi Saarberg from Finland. The first thing about this is standardization. We see outcomes-based results for both teachers and for students, which means that everything becomes standardized. This reduces experimentation. It means that we measure children, especially by quantitative and numerical standards. So what becomes important are the numbers, because numbers are easy. Numbers are good for policy and for government, because you can show numbers to government, and they can see very quickly and easily what that means. It's not about narrative. It's not about stories. It's not about individual people. That can be quite uncomfortable. That's not wanted. What's wanted are the big numbers. Also, standardization helps us to get better scores in things like PISA tests. There's also a focus on core subjects, so especially literacy and numeracy, but also some science. The reason why there's this focus is because these are the things that have been pinpointed to show what excellence is, which means that schools invariably push all of their focus into these subjects, and all the other subjects then suffer as a result. There's also a way to get low-risk ways to getting to your goals. Teachers know that the best way to get through the day is to choose the path of least resistance. So all of your creativity, all of your different ways of doing things get dropped just so that we can pull the highest score out of the results of what the children do. We use corporate management models, which are motivated by national hegemony and economic profit over moral goals of human development. You see this a lot in leadership terms when we talk about transformational, transactional, situated leadership. These are not educational terms. These are business terms. We see test-based accountability, where achievement is closely tied to accrediting, promoting, inspecting, rewarding, and punishing schools and teachers. However, we have international schools. For many, this is a renaissance of schooling. This is a space where freedom happens, creativity, where teachers can unpack all of those things that they learnt, where they can live and teach and do things that they thought they never could. International schools, in many ways, are a renaissance. They are there, unlike establishment and national forms of private schooling. International schools advocate for internationalism, global-mindedness, and peace. There is a huge potential here and a huge resource to address, point on those big questions that face our young people and our children. They are based upon global citizenship education. As you can read there, global citizenship education addresses head-on those problems of inequality, migration, the climate crisis. These things have been pushed by organizations such as the United Nations, which for its limited and underfunded remit has done a lot of very good work around the world, reducing things like lack of literacy and poverty and child mortality. Very, very good things that have happened despite all the negativity of inequality. Organizations like the Council of International Schools are steeped in the concept of global citizenship education, as is the International Baccalaureate Organization. Their mission statement is a call to arms to address inequality and injustice around the world. The reason why international schools are growing so much and why they're having such a massive, almost hyperbolic growth is because of the fact that we see the middle classes of the South growing. So the top picture shows you how the middle classes of the South were in, what's the date, 2009. So 28% of the middle classes were in the Asia-Pacific area, against 36% in Europe. 2030 predictions from the United Nations Human Development Report of 2013 predict the global middle classes of Asia-Pacific to then take over 66% of the global middle classes. Now, middle classes and upper middle classes seek distinction for their children. Advantage is replicated, we know that. And one of the best ways to replicate advantage is through what Illich called the second womb, the classroom. In that classroom, your child learns all the distinct practices that make it different from other people, that make it distinct, and therefore make it better. As Pierre Bourdieu says, we are all innate snobs deep down inside, and we all seek our distinction. And international schools understand this very well, and this is what they cater to. Let's look at some of the statistics of international schools versus schools in England. There are currently 10,282 international schools around the world, with 5.36 million students, with nearly £40 million worth of revenue, with over 500,000 staff. In England, we have a lot more smaller schools, so the numbers are bigger. We don't have many more students. We have less money, and we have fewer teachers. And the predictions show us that by 2028, there will be nearly 10 million international school students, with close to 1 million teachers. England is a developed, mature society with a population as England on its own of around about 50 million people. We have fewer teachers by far than in the international school sector in 2028. You're looking at a nation spread across the globe, but a nation without knowledge generation, without systemization, and without any kind of remit that we know of that is structured. The booming field of international education is expensive, it is expanding, and it is excellent. They are spaces of unparalleled educational innovation, freedom, autonomy, and internationalization. The graduates come from significantly empowered socioeconomic backgrounds. That means that we teach people who, if they don't have power, they are going towards power. These people are influencers. These people can possibly change the world in a way much more than people from more impoverished backgrounds come from. Hence, again, the onus upon us as educators and educational leaders to get to the source of the influence and make change happen. Now I'm going to problematize international schools. So, future citizens will become what we do and not what we say. A point of reflection for all leadership in schools, for all teachers. How do we manifest? How are we to the children and the young people? What does leadership do and how does it act? Because that is what these global citizens will become. We can put them through as many projects as we want and assess them as hard as we like and expose them to as many projects as we want about making the world a better place. But if we do not manifest in this way, then it's all for nothing. Through others, we become ourselves. Pierce draws on the literature to remark on a narcissistic element of the international school, in that they are self-consciously concerned with themselves and what they are. Pierce's argument attributes this to their being exceptional, as they are outsiders, having been founded as alternatives to state schooling or established private schools, or out of idealism. International schools can be difficult places to be in as a teacher. In many countries, international school staff appear to have little or no representation, as in there are no unions to represent them. And so they are free to vote with their feet, which means if you have a grievance, well, the way you can address that grievance is by leaving. However, when moving on, the confidential references are vital to teachers. Teachers need a good reference from their principal and from their director. If they don't get them, they are in a very bad place to be able to move into a better position afterwards. This is an untenable and ethically very worrying situation, which no one is talking about and no one is addressing. These are things that address the authenticity and the rigor of international schools and what they are. These are questions that will have to be addressed at some time in the future. Does this mean, then, that a teacher who works in an international school works in a field that is defined by compliance? If my reference is so important, and if antagonism in conflict is not wished for, does this mean that everything that happens in an international school happens by the will and the whim of the leader, because no one will address that, because they're worried about their reference? I'm going to let these pictures speak for themselves. Pierre Bourdieu develops the concept of field and habitus. So he talks about a field. International schools are a field. Each one of you has a particular habitus. That means you manifest in a particular way. Depending upon your habitus, you will either be more or less successful in the field. So, how do you dress? How do you talk? What qualifications do you have? What skin color do you have? What accent do you have? Where do you come from? This defines your habitus. I found in my own research on international schools leadership that those people who managed to get to the apex positions in international schools, the directors of the very most prestigious schools in international schools in the world, all had similar aspects of habitus. They were white, they were Christian, they were English or American, and they were generally fairly religious in how they looked at the world. They drew enormous capital from this background of who they were and what they were. International schools offer more than just a qualification capital to cross epistemic divides. So epistemic divides are thought divides. How do people think in India? How do they think in China? Well, we think differently in the West. The way we think is right? We are the product of the Enlightenment. Our thinking is better than everybody else's. This is a divide. So it's often difficult to cross that divide. International schools offer that currency. They offer the currency to cross the epistemic divides in order to get into the universities, the colleges, and the corporations that otherwise would be closed to people who come from backgrounds that don't quite fit the field. International schools both enact the gaze and exploit the effects. I'll talk about the gaze in a minute, but this picture tells you very much about the gaze. International schools offer a field characterized by whiteness, Englishness, and English Anglo culture. And habitus adapts to the field or moves to another field. Bourdieu is quite clear on this. If your habitus doesn't fit in the field, then you will move to a different field. You cannot succeed. Take, for example, a lawyer. Lawyer works in the legal field. If a lawyer turns up to work dressed in ripped jeans and a t-shirt, speaks in heavy dialects and potentially manifests as something that doesn't fit with legalese, the lawyer will not be successful, and after a while will be pushed from the field or move by their own volition. Habitus adapts to the field or moves to another field. Anne Kaplan, a notable feminist, wrote about something called the gaze. The gaze is the way that women feel they must act when gazed upon by the man. It's not how they are, but it's how they feel they should react to the gaze. It's when you get women being all girly or silly or wearing particular clothes that accentuate an idea of feminism that is presented by the male. But the gaze also happens in post-colonial aspects as well. International schools, in many ways, enact the gaze. And they do it all over the world. We take an idea of whiteness, we take an idea of Englishness, and we gaze that upon the environments where we are. And it's a commodity, because people want it. They buy it. They send their children to that school, because that's what they want their children to have. They want to be able to talk like that, and walk like that, and move like that. This is not me being mean, this is sociology. This is what happens. But international schools capitalize upon this. The international gaze. International schools offer more than just qualification capital to cross epistemic divides and gaining entry to Anglo-Western universities and corporations. International schools provide a field of Western advantage with the affordances of Anglo-Western habitus. Their market value is contingent on the above. We like to think the market value is contingent upon the fact that we offer robust qualifications. But that's only half of the story. The other half, and if we think seriously about it, we all know it, is that we actually sell something quite different from that. The market value is contingent on the above, which means that this is a cultural laundromat, if you think about it. So in some international schools, you'll find an increased level of hierarchy happening. One of the things that schools try and do very strongly, say in Britain or in the US, is get rid of hierarchy. Teachers don't like hierarchy. Teachers get into the profession because they like working collegially. They get into a profession that is defined by people like them, who have similar backgrounds. We all went to university. We all studied something. We're all clever, right? Cool, let's get on with our jobs. What teachers don't like is having it lorded over them by somebody who's 16 positions above them on a salary 10 times as much as they're on, right? They don't like that. That's not what they got into the job for. However, in international schools, you find notable hierarchies. I was embedded in international school for 5 years, and I was shocked at the amount of hierarchy that I saw. I'm pleased to say that in Hong Kong, I've had a couple of chats with people. It doesn't seem like the hierarchies are quite so present here, but this is the hierarchy that I experienced. Top of the chain is the administrator or board member. In this particular case, business class flights, company car, big accommodation, huge amounts of authority. Honestly, life-changing power. The type of power you would not experience in the West. Next comes the overseas hire. These people have been recruited at an international jobs fair. They get all of the package and everything. Next is the local expat hire who's been recruited locally, gets a good salary but not necessarily the package. Then you have the local hire who is local. They're further down in the chain. And then you have the local hire assistant, teaching assistant, who's kind of bottom of the chain. And then right at the very bottom, you have the unreferenced educators. These are the ones, foolish that they are, that may have at some point disagreed with the director or somebody higher up the food chain, and now they don't have a reference. They might actually get quite a good reference from the director or principal, but they're not prepared to go there. Or maybe they're very proud and they don't want to. This reminded very much of this. There are rigid realities in international educational spaces. Choice in international career progression is about compliance. However, education is all about risk. It's all about challenge. It's all about exchanging ideas. And yet in these vibrant places of free education, we have managed to usher in a system that brings with it rigid technical realities. In a focus group in Singapore that I was in 6 months ago, I asked a group of very well-qualified and very good teachers, what would happen if they had a dispute with a director? And all three of them said the same thing. You will never work in international schools again. Good. That sounds pretty harsh, but that's what they said. They're not my words. I'm going to talk now about my own research, so into directors. Nobody knows much about international schools directors. No real research has been done on them. We've all read the stories. Everybody knows the International Schools Review, ISR, but we don't actually know much really about them. Who are they? How did they get there? Why are they there? So that's what my research was about. And I researched 6 international schools directors in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. Very prestigious schools with a huge history. These are great schools. So I found that market pressures reduced leadership agency. The studies found that organizations had extended hierarchy. Participants related deep beliefs in global citizenship education for leadership. The pressures of marketization drove a transactional culture. Normative narratives struggled to keep up with descriptive practice. What that means is they talk a very good talk. They talk about fairness, equality, and inclusion. But that struggles to keep up with the reality of what happens in their school and how they run the school. The rigid pressures of board and marketization combine with the expatriate culture of intensified relationship and isolation to facilitate leadership that gravitates towards transaction and managerialism, whilst presenting an image of transformation and empowerment. Barry was one of my international schools directors. It's not his real name. It's one of his statements. I had 2 principals who were not coming on side, so I waited until I could replace them by not renewing them. Now, normally, in an educational situation, you try very hard, wouldn't you, to work with people, find a way to move through problems together. That doesn't have to be an option in this scenario, because you have the power and you have the hierarchy. If you don't like someone, you get rid of them, and you bring in the next one. This is what Habermas talks about as a problem-solution culture. It's very much in the technical domain. You buy products to suit your needs. This is marketization happening at an ontological level throughout the schools. Charles said, the legal system here and the workers' rights make it very difficult to actually get anything done. Elvin said, we want a merit-based appraisal and remuneration system where academic qualifications don't count. It's the things you do in school that count. Sounds good, doesn't it? But who measures it? We will reduce free tuition to 1 child per teacher. After all, if you work in international schools, you just have to face up to it. These are very, very big ethical things that are being said here. And they're said normally and off the cuff. Alfred, been there, seen it, done the course, tick the box. I can move on and do something else. Have you really changed hearts and minds? Have you really created people who leave the school passionate about their global social responsibility? That, to me, is the challenge. This is Alfred talking about global citizenship education. I'm not kidding you. These people are overwhelmingly committed, very convincing. And as a researcher, you have to take a step back because you start coming in to their circle of influence. They influence you very quickly. But I'm afterwards. And this is what he then said off tape. I had 30 teachers coming up for tenure, so I let them all go just to send out a message. It is a privilege to work here, not an expectation. So this is something that normally we'd call despotic or tyrannical. However, this director is able to say this and at the same time talk about global citizenship education and what a good person they are. So what you'll find in the school system is our dualities that very often in a normal situation could not coexist together. However, in this international sphere, they do. Analysis from thesis showed that directors preferred a more general kind of global citizenship education than the IB learner profile, for example. Why? Well, because the IB learner profile is quite definite. It says these are the attributes that you should lead by, whereas global citizenship education, you can kind of interpret what you like into it. So it makes a lot of sense for them to do that. This is a pivotal point in leading international schools, as we'll come on to in a minute. They found that moral leadership was vital, which is good. But with moral leadership, you always have to ask yourself, whose morals? They found meritocracy important. And they capitalized on the cultural capital of being English, US, American, white, middle class, and Christian. That's their narrative, and it's very powerful. So, directors and leadership. Beyond models and styles, so models of leadership and styles of leadership, this would be leadership theory, directors found global-mindedness and global citizenship education more important to leadership in international schools than any other factor. All but one did not model the values of the school organization, the IB Learner Profile, but those of their personal worldview. The findings from ethnographic study, where I was embedded, showed me this. Leadership in international schools means distance from teaching. The more distanced you are from the classroom, the more important you are. The closer you are to teaching and children, the less important you are. A heightened danger of leadership self-aggrandizement. Now, leaders are always susceptible to self-aggrandizement. That's normal, right? That's something they have to deal with all the time. But in this context here, due to isolation, increased power, and closer relationships, this is self-aggrandizement on steroids. Heightened danger of, I said that one, sorry, and de-intellectualized leadership and teachers. So this is a big challenge for teachers in the last 30, 40 years. The role of the teacher has been successively de-intellectualized. Teachers are made more and more to be technical members of something a bit like an assembly line. If you take away the intellectual agency of teachers, it makes it easier to replace them when you want to, but it also takes away those individual narratives and stories that make a difference, that are uncomfortable for policy, that tell stories of children and what they need. So if you de-intellectualize teachers, it makes the whole process a lot easier to basically get what you want in a school. But you see this process too amongst leadership, that leadership becomes de-intellectualized. Now, leadership is an intellectual practice. Anything that you learn in a skills-based workshop about leadership is not leadership. That's management, or it's administration. But leadership is about capacity, about mental capacity, about critical thinking, about understanding power relationships. That, I found, was minimized. I found there was a tendency towards micro-politicking over professionalism. And this is very difficult for teachers, because if teachers have no avenue to express themselves, then all they can do is organize together in groups and express themselves to each other. These are typical characteristics of transactional leadership. Performativity. So if any of you know the work of Judith Butler, performativity is what we do when we feel we have to behave in a particular way to fulfill a particular role. You see that a lot. You see people being the leader, performing as a leader, which is the death of leadership, because leadership is about authenticity. It's about influencing people. The moment you become somebody you're not in order to influence is the moment you lose everybody. Feels good for you, but it doesn't feel good for everybody else. So, leadership theory and why it's wrong. You're probably looking at that and thinking, that's a triangle. So, hands up if you see a triangle. Hands up if you see three circles. Right, okay. Hands up if you see both. Yeah, good. Teachers, clever people. Right. So, the trouble with a leadership theory or a leadership model is the danger of reification. Reification is when you take a concept and you breathe life into it and you make it real, despite the fact that it might not even exist. So we have all of these terms of leadership that we use to define what leadership is. But actually, even the term leadership itself is problematic. When we think of leadership, we know the one thing we can be sure about leadership is that it's about influence. That's all. But when we look at the historical story of leadership, it's about strong men on battlefields doing man stuff, running round with swords and killing each other, or being killed. Leadership, right? Wherever you go in the world, that is the conception of leadership. So when you talk to people who have limited or no knowledge of leadership, their initial thought of what a good leader is authority, power, strength, getting things done. This picture shows us quite well how transactional and authoritarian forms of leadership work. Leadership has always typically been the reserve of elites, right? I used to work at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. We used to do a lot of work on leadership. Obviously, it's the National Leadership Centre. That's a place where elites were brought in. They weren't taught leadership. They were taught to paint and play tennis, play golf, and run around a battlefield and kill each other. Because they didn't need to teach leadership because these were sons of princes and dukes and earls. They didn't need to learn about leadership because they were leaders. Unfortunately, with the invention of the machine gun and the First World War, they all died. And then Sandhurst suddenly had to come up with another option, which was teach people about leadership, right? But it still has always been steeped in this idea of elitism. This is someone leading by the sword. You can do that. This type of leadership is easy. Any simpleton can do this. It's not very complex at all. There are dozens of different leadership styles, and all of them come from business. Because when leadership stopped being about the military, and with the advent of Fordism and Taylorism, it started becoming about manufacturing and economics. So whenever we talk about leadership, even in education, we borrow from business models. Transactional leadership, situated leadership, transformational leadership, distributed leadership, etc., etc., etc. So there are two main types of leadership that I'll talk about now. One is transformational and one is transactional. Transactional leadership is when you build no relationship with someone. You say, you do this, they do it, and if they do it well, you reward them. If they do it badly, you punish them. Transactional leadership. It's a transaction. Teachers don't like this form of leadership. Research has shown us that teachers like transformational leadership or distributed leadership. This is where you empower people. This is where collegiality is very important, and professionalism. So, people aren't stupid, and leaders aren't stupid. So leaders know that they have to be more open and more collegial towards their teachers, because otherwise they will vote with their feet, and they will leave. And then teacher retention goes down, and that's bad. We don't like that. So we have to be kind and nice to the teachers. However, you've got the board behind you. You've got the pressures of bums on seats. So you can't be quite as empowering as you'd like to be because you have these economic pressures. So leaders aren't stupid either. So what they do very often is this. What I would call a cloaking of transactional leadership with a transformational veneer. This I saw again and again and again in my research. And it makes perfect sense. And even in the leadership literature, these two forms of literature are very, very closely connected. So Walker, Bryant, and Lee, actually a Hong Kong group here, say that conflict between IB student-centered philosophy and conventionally examination-driven and teacher-centered educational norms found in Confucian heritage societies, a tendency for IB schools to focus on DP outcomes due to the importance of DP examination results for university admissions. This is another instrumental pressure that pushes leadership. You've got to focus upon the results. You've got to get the grades, because if you don't, your reputation goes down. So you've got to push these grades. But on the other hand, you've got the IB, which is saying it's about the whole child. It's about global citizenship. These are enormous tensions that leadership is under. And so now, whilst I make no apologies for educational leadership in international schools, I would like to point out it's an incredibly antagonistic and difficult situation to be in. So technical thinking leads education in many ways. We find that the emancipatory domain is of secondary merit in education. So how do international schools staff escape their modeling? Remember at the beginning I said many staff come from national contexts. They bring this impoverished sense of what it is to be in a school. How do they escape that when they end up in an international school? How do they embrace the freedoms there? How does the leadership staff do that? Because scarcity and technical thinking can become imprinted upon teachers and their leadership. International schools are special places. You have much higher levels of autonomy in an international school. You have increased autonomy, but the increased autonomy brings with it increased intellectual demands on the teacher and on the leader. Modeled behavior from origin countries can influence thinking patterns. So learned dependency can be difficult to recover from, especially in leadership. So here are some facts from the research from educational leadership. So international teaching profession struggles to retain staff. It has a high turnover of staff. There is a great need to improve recruitment and retention of quality overseas teachers. Itchy feet and high staff turnover imply serious pedagogical disruption. We've all been there. We've all seen it. The firing of a principal is a frequent occurrence, and this situation is a disease. And the school is now in a self-perpetuating cycle of short-termism, lurching from one crisis to the next. That's Blandford and Shaw. Caffin, himself, an international school's principal. I'll let you read that on your own. So, what can we do? It's a difficult situation to be in. International schools are great places. They have huge amounts of freedom. They are well-resourced. They have this scope to change the world. And yet the organization of them is very problematic and very difficult. Well, Morphier and Stevenson and Thompson and Fox show that understanding and modeling the values of, here the IB learner profile, but in general, the organizational values. Modeling the values. That's modeling them. That's not talking about them. That's modeling them, being them, doing them. These things are pivotal to the success of the operation of an international school. Caffin and Keller support the significance of the IB learner profile as shared values in the challenging environment of international schools leadership, just as with Stevenson, Thompson, and Fox. The IB continuum in leadership is regarded as being central to the uptake and success of the program in day-to-day teaching and learning. So this is talking about buy-in into the school program. Not talking about how in your last school system it was better, or how it could be better if you did something else, but investing yourself in the system you're in. Leaders need to support curriculum coordinators, but also develop their own formalized knowledge of leadership in their work with team leaders to develop clarity and self-efficacy in teams. That's a big one in international schools, developing self-efficacy in teams. Another result that comes out, which I haven't got up here, is how international schools leadership is not particularly good at fostering leadership in their own schools. That's one criticism of the international schools leadership. They look after themselves in terms of leadership, but they don't grow leadership. This is a big problem, and we can see that this is one of the reasons why the leadership landscape of international schools is in crisis. If you're not building leadership capacity within the schools, how are you going to have good leaders in the future? Leaders need to support... Oh, I've just done that one, haven't I? Yes. Right. Bryant found that support in leading and developing people was lacking. There we go. Teacher managers required formal guidance and psychological supervision. Bryant found this to be supportive of context-based leadership training, working together with formal academic training and a need for principals to prioritize this type of in-house leadership training. So Bryant's saying there, yes, you need to develop intellectual capacity. You need to do things like formalized degrees, like a master's degree, like a postgraduate certificate, but you also need to do in-house training. You need to invest time in growing leadership. Before I go into that, I was talking to 3 leaders in Dubai last week, three principals of quite prestigious schools, and what I noticed again and again is how educational leaders, they always talk about the children. They always talk about the product. They always talk about the assembly line. They never talk about their colleagues, which I find quite remarkable, because the colleagues, the teachers, they're the ones who are the capital of the school. That even as a parent or as a researcher, they're the ones I want to know about. Because I can walk around the school and see happy children's faces. I can see that. That's fine. I want to know about the teachers. How happy are they? How well are they getting on? But because they're in this industrial model, in this technical model, they have to sell the product, it seems to me. So, some good work coming out of Finland at the moment, which is talking about, because the Finns are big on global citizenship education too. If we don't model these things, if we don't model equity, fairness, if we don't treat each other in these ways, if we don't develop relational leadership, if we don't respect professionalism within the organization, children see that. It's like with your mum and dad when you're a kid. They tell you one thing, but you see what they do. And that imprints itself on you, and that's what you become, no matter what they said to you. If we don't do that, all we've done is we've taught the next generation of potential exploiters how to talk the talk of compassion. How dangerous is that? And that's work coming out of Finland at the moment, not mine. So the loneliness of leadership, right? It's a big problem. Poor leaders, they're so lonely. Well, when I was at Sandhurst, that one there on the right, one of my students, one of my cadets, not that lonely, really. To get him there was a support group that helped him get all the way. That was a big thing to get him there, and there was a huge amount of support. That one there in the middle, from Uganda. Again, there's the huge support group in the background. Leadership doesn't have to be a lonely place. But in an isolated context, like an international school, it becomes it very, very quickly. This is why leaders need to develop a relational approach to leadership, need to respect professionality, need to respect collegiality, because the support for leadership is in the faculty. Because essentially, an educational leader is not a leader, because every teacher is a leader. All the educational leader is the head teacher. Now, wrapping it up, and my main point and takeaway from this is an overview of global citizenship education. Now, I did something very simple, and I just made it about leadership. And if you replace words in there, such as the world, the community, with things like the school, my colleagues, you find a model of educational leadership in waiting, something that addresses the challenges and demands of the 21st century, something that allows our educational leaders to address the crisis that is happening to our children as they're growing up. Rather than us being focused upon the technical spreadsheets and the dealing with the day-to-day, we need to be seeing the bigger picture. And we need to be modeling that to teachers and to students and children if we really want to see out this century, or we want our children to see out this century. And I think if anyone is set to change this, it is the leadership in education that will do it, because we are the ones who build the citizens of the next generation. We need to move away from technical thinking in education. We need to reduce the hierarchies we have. We need to accept that we are educators, we are educated, we are intellectual, we work with knowledge, we are highly skilled in working with people. We do a job that other people cannot do, and yet we get told to do what to do by people who can't do what we do. There is a way to find irresistible leadership, and that is through generosity. Even when the chips are down, even when the money's scarce, generosity starts here. It starts in your thinking and in your heart. If you can be emancipatory, if you can be authentic, and if you can be relational, you will generate trust in other people. They will trust you as their colleague. as a professional, if you can generate that trust, your influence will be remarkable and you will be remembered. As Bandura says, most human behavior is learned observationally through modeling. From observing others, one forms an idea as to how new behaviors are performed, and on later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action. If you want to read any of my work, here's a few of them up there. If anybody's interested in pursuing this further, we have a master's degree in educational leadership in practice at Manchester, of which I am the course director. Much of what you heard today comes from our faculty. We work in the critical domain. We are one of the world leaders in educational leadership, knowledge generation, and if you are interested in pursuing those thoughts formally, then please do get in contact. Thank you very much.